Hello, my name is Asha Perkins. This is my Module 4 of the Research Methods Needs Assessment presentation. To begin our discussion on the needs assessment approach, I would like to begin with a quote by Craig Lonsbro. He says, "Sometimes we can't quite put our finger on something important because we've got all of our fingers wrapped around a bunch of other things that are not important." This reminds me of the definition of irony, right? The difference between what's expected and what actually is. And needs assessment is just like that. It explores what the reality of a situation is within education or the business fields, and it explores what are the gaps in that reality. A more technical definition of what the needs assessment approach is noted by Ellis, a systematic examination of the gap that exists between the current state and desired state of an organization and the factors that can be attributed to this gap. Let's begin to talk about some of the background and history of the needs assessment approach. In 1943, Abraham Maslow introduces the concept of needs. It's one of my favorite educational theory because in it, the hierarchy of needs addresses motivation and why people act or don't act as they do. So then, after he proposes this hierarchy of needs, the concept of needs seeps into the realm of education. In 1965, we see that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act goes through, with then CIPP, Context, Input, Process, and Product, being pushed forward by Daniel Stufflebeam. From those early years, we move on to the formative years of the 1960s and 1980s. And here we're going to see that the needs assessment movement speeds up rather quickly. 1967, Tom Gilbert says, "Let's begin to train people on how to properly use the needs assessment approach." And then we see many authors begin to produce literature on the topic. There was a conference in 1976, and it was sponsored by the National Institute of Education. So we see more and more people respecting the needs assessment approach as a viable way of recognizing and diagnosing gaps. The 1980s to 1990s marks the coming of age era. Here we see universities and colleges begin to build courses within their scope and sequences to actually train students and practitioners how to use the needs assessment approach efficiently. We also see a resurgence of criticism from prior years that want to indicate that we need to start with strengths and not deficits. We also see authors continue to develop pertinent literature. During the productive years, academia continues to rethink the strength of the needs-based approach, and criticism still remains. Strength-based advising assessment comes to the forefront, and literature continues to be produced. 2010, we see the building of foundation era where needs assessment continues to be a valuable means of research, as well as the emergence of hybrid-like needs assessment with capacity building. And then Altschuld compiles his 5-volume needs assessment kit, which is a resource for practitioners and educators and business people alike. And then lastly, 2010 to the present, the mature years, we see a continual evolution of literature and refinement in the needs assessment field. What are the major features of the needs assessment approach? There are two major types of assessments, direct and indirect, that can be used within the needs assessment framework. Direct assessment will come from the subject themselves and the ways in which the data, which is often quantitative in scope, is designed and collected must have institutional approval. While indirect assessment is less formal and can be collected at any time during the inquiry process. Both of these assessment methods will lead an educator to have data to be able to do three major things according to Macaulay. Number one, be able to well define a current issue. Two, develop a program and then articulate how the data supports the tenets of the program. And three, be able to relate how the subjects and stakeholders of the program will benefit. According to Cusio and Husby Slater, there are seven major steps that a planning team needs to consider when planning a needs assessment approach. The first step is to write your objectives. There are several guiding questions that will be included on the next few slides, and I'll be highlighting a few. Again, we want to think about those three guiding questions that were shared on the previous slide. In addition to those three major items, a planning team needs to consider who needs to be involved in the process, what will everyone's role be, and how will the findings be disseminated. The next step is to be very sure about the audience being served, including the stakeholders. Who is the intended audience and whose needs are being researched must be crystal clear tenets while planning the needs assessment. The third step is to collect data. Will the data collected answer the essential question, and how will the data be ascertained? These are two important steps within the collecting data phase. The planning team must pick an instrument of data collection that best fits and reflects the needs of the needs assessment. Are there any data points that we can utilize at the offset of the needs assessment? And then what method of data collection would best match with the information that needs to be collected? And that can be done in one or more ways or a mixed method approach as well. And the planning team must always keep in mind how will the information be gathered in the final presentation. Step 5 will have the planning team to select the audience sample. Which of the respondents will represent the intended audience? After a careful look, the planning team will sometimes realize that some of the respondents do not match the criteria for the needs assessment previously given. Now that the data has been collected and the audience sample has been delineated, now the planning team must analyze the data. What will be the biggest impact solution to remedy the gap identified based off of the responses given? And out of the remaining gap discovery, which should be the do now task? The final step has the planning team following up. What continuing conversations need to be had? How can the team address the progenitor factors in the issue? And then, is there any additional data that must be collected to have a complete response and a complete answer? Using the needs assessment approach has many benefits. It allows for assessment of gaps in what the real needs are of a given populace. It allows for a response solution to address those gaps and needs. It allows for continuous improvement through a systematic plan. And last but not least, it incorporates valid and reliable data to help guide financial and programming decisions. And that's so important today in the age of severe budget cuts. One of the major complaints of educators across the country is communication or the lack thereof that is shared between districts, campuses, admin, teachers, staff. Cusio and Husby Slater calls to carpet districts, and that when considering the needs approach, they should be proactive in sharing information and encouraging campuses to share information across the board. For instance, the third bullet says, let's identify resources and strategies that can work across schools to create efficiencies in implementing needs assessments across school buildings. Like, this is revolutionary because a lot of times within education, schools remain in their silos. This type of approach allows for the pulling together of resources and creative ideas that can solve common ills and problems. Cusio and Husby Slater also suggest that districts should provide assistance with communications to stakeholders so that the campus alone is not responsible for needs assessment activities, but it is a shared work between the district and schools because it is a shared vision and shared students that are being served. The needs assessment approach is definitely not for every situation that involves a problem within the educational or business settings. Needs assessment should not be used when it has already been genuinely determined what the gaps and needs are. It should not be used when stakeholders have already determined that change is not necessary without additional data to help influence their minds. Needs assessment should not be used if funds are not adequate to collect data or implement new change. And then, last but not least, needs assessment should not be done if there's not enough time to gather accurate data. Needs assessment can be used in a variety of ways in research. The main focus of needs assessment is going to be to identify the gaps that exist within a particular institution. Thus, when those gaps are identified, research can be used to determine what program will be best, what solution will be best, and how it affects the stakeholder population. To wrap up our discussion on the needs assessment research approach, Peter Drucker's quote come to mind. Unless strategy evaluation is performed seriously and systematically, and unless strategists are willing to act on the results, energy will be used up defending yesterday. Defending yesterday cost school districts and businesses millions of dollars, millions of minutes and energy wasted. If we are not willing to dig in deep and take a look at the gaps and assess them genuinely and authentically, we are doing a disservice to our students. We are doing a disservice to our educational stakeholders and communities. It is so imperative that we jump in and utilize other mixed and hybrid approaches to not only build on needs assessment, but also building capital to come up with formidable solutions for tomorrow's problems.